We're here with Patrick McMillan today at the Botanical Gardens, which is located on Clemson's campus, and we are going to talk about Piedmont Prairie restoration today. So I'll let him take it on.
Okay. Well, what we've done here at the South Carolina Botanical Garden is really kind of unique. I work with a lot of prairie restoration projects or meadow restoration projects, both in formal landscapes and also in natural areas, and I've done that for years across the Southeast. And the one here at the South Carolina Botanical Garden was, I won't say it's completely atypical, but it is unusual in that we were restoring a prairie system here, a Piedmont prairie system, into a site that was that has a very rich soil. We were very lucky, and at the same time it made it very difficult because this property was, when it was part of the Calhoun estate, was a cattle field instead of being cotton. So we still have about 4 feet of topsoil in place here at the South Carolina Botanical Garden. And in most prairie restoration sites that you'll be working with in the Piedmont of South Carolina, that's not the case. Most of them, that soil was washed away with cotton culture and you're left with subsoil with that brick hard red clay. And believe it or not, that's actually easier to establish most native grass systems into because it's more nutrient poor and it's more stressful on the plants. And most of the plants that are out here in the Piedmont Prairie system are stress tolerant plants. So they grow slow, they take a long time to establish, but once they are established, they're pretty much bulletproof. So here we have about a 9-acre site. We restored 4 acres of it right away, and the way that we had to do this because of the rich soil was we actually had to grow out the plants into plugs, and a lot of them into 1-gallon size plants. And we started this restoration project in 2012, and it's now 2017, so we're 5 years in, and we have a fully restored, fully functioning prairie ecosystem out here that is pretty similar, I think, to what people like Mark Catesby would have seen back in 1723 when he describes the vast savannas that covered this part of South Carolina, and when early explorers like that talk about grasses being higher than the horse's head. And so if you restore one of these on brick hard red clay, the big blue stem and Indian grass are going to be like this, but here we have 12, 15 foot tall big blue stems out here, largely because of the soil fertility that's still present on this site with the grassland soils that we have. So I had to actually do this by planting out about 17,000 plugs of grass, and that gave them an edge on the weeds, because your biggest challenge when you're doing one of these restoration projects is weed competition. So there's a couple ways around that. One, if you start with semi-mature plants, if you start planting out plugs, you're going to actually give those plugs an advantage over the weeds that would come into the system. Or secondly, you can just have patience because if you're working on a clay soil, for instance, not a really rich mollisol loam like I had here, but a good clay soil, you can seed drill into that site. And if you plant over it with a cover crop, and a lot of times what I'll do is I'll drill those seeds in and then I'll use something like a winter wheat or a rye as a cool season cover crop. It gives you a cover over those developing seedlings during the spring, and then by the time the summer sets in, those things are dying back, and hopefully you have enough of the native grasses to come up into that mix that that they start to compete with weeds. No matter what you do with prairie restoration, it's going to be 3 years before it even begins to look like a native prairie, and really about 5 years before it's totally set in, like the one we see here, and now really operating as a native system. So installments, the first phase, seed drilling seeds, and you want to make sure with these prairie systems that you drill in the structure components, the ground components, and your forbs that you want to have in the system at the same time. If you try to go back into an established bunch grassland like the one I'm at here, and try to install flowering plants after the grasses are established, you're probably going to fail because the grasses tend to really outcompete and shade out most everything that's in this system. So we start, if we're doing a seed preparation, we'll start with a mix of species that are targeted species for your area. So everything in this prairie system was raised from local seed sources. We're lucky here, we have 9 greenhouses that we can grow things out in. But if you want to look at your area, look at your target. What are you growing the prairie for? Is it for wildlife? Is it for to restore a native ecosystem? What's your target? And you want to make sure you're putting all those target species in at the get-go. So if you're seed drilling, make sure that there's forb seeds going in there. And within the first 2 or 3 years, if you want to put in individual plants of prairie dock or Schweinitz's sunflower or butterfly weed, whatever your targets are, you want to make sure you get them in those establishing phases of the prairie, because once it's at this point, you've essentially got a functioning ecosystem. It's going to be harder to get something into. People have different opinions on when to burn, how to burn, or how to maintain these prairies systems, and we use the method that was described by Mark Catesby and John Bartram, William Bartram, all the guys who were coming through this area, when they talk about the Native Americans burning the Piedmont landscape every spring. So we come in and we've done a management fire from the very first year, when it was mostly weeds with a little bit of grass, up until this year. We've every single spring come in and done a fire. And what I found is there's very little impact to the recruitment of seedlings when you do burn in the late dormant season. So we try to burn in between February and April, and most of the time it does fall in February when we have just the right conditions out here to burn. And burning annually is not a detriment at all to these ecosystems, in at least what I've noticed over the years, and in all the study I've done of grassland ecology in the southeastern United States. If you want it to look nice, you burn it every year. The burning will discourage a lot of European weeds, discourage a lot of the weeds that will be coming up early in the growing season, and it does not discourage South American or African weeds. So you'll find verbenas and cydas and plants that are actually adapted to fire in the ecosystems they live in Africa and South America do quite well even with fire here in our landscape. So part of the management on these systems does require some physical pulling, and we also use some chemical treatment. Particularly when it comes to woody encroaching plants like Bradford pear, Callery pear, which is just springs up everywhere because it's bird dispersed seeds. But when you get it to this point right here, even Callery pear has a hard time competing with the sod of grass and native forbs that are in the ecosystem. So definitely a benefit to wildlife. What we've noticed here at the Botanical Garden is since we went from having just mowed grass to having many spaces that either are mowed on an annual basis or burned and have native grasslands, is we've seen a jump in our bird diversity from 112 species up to 206 species recorded for the garden and surrounding area. And we've seen a bump in even our frog species, and frogs and toads have gone up to 18 species from 11 species recorded beforehand. And you only have to visit for a few moments any time of the year here to see things that we never saw in the Botanical Garden before. In the spring we'll have huge flocks of bobolinks coming into this field being chased by peregrine falcons. That never happened in the Botanical Garden before. We have grasshopper sparrows breeding in this meadow. We have visits by Henslow sparrows, and simply the sound of all of those insects out there tells you how rich this system is. And the grass seeds and the abundance of insects have also led to an abundance of small mammals. And the small mammals have drawn in particularly cotton rats, but cotton rats and meadow voles have drawn in huge numbers of predatory animals too. So we're talking about red-tailed hawks and great horned owls, which never really used the garden before, using the garden in large numbers today. So pretty neat system if you can do it. So the chemical treatments that we do use, the herbicides that we use on site, are pretty standard stuff. So if you're trying to treat broad-leaved trees like Callery pear, Roundup can be used, but also 2,4-D compounds. So things like Garland, Arsenal, those things we've used on site too. It just depends on what your target is. Sometimes those 2,4-Ds, if you're overspraying on grass, they won't impact the grass, but they'll get rid of the sweet gum or the water oaks or Callery pear that come into the system. So those can be useful tools. As far as like the wildlife value of the this ecosystem and where it fits in, I think it's always interesting to to think about how much South Carolina has changed since, say, when Mark Catesby walked up to Clemson in 1723 and again in the autumn of 1724, he wouldn't even recognize the place, because the upstate that he describes, and he describes it both in the natural history of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands, which you can read online in the appendix, and he describes it in letters and on labels that he was writing when he was sending specimens back to England. He talks about a Piedmont landscape that is a vast savanna. Now, they didn't have the word for prairie back then. Prairie is a French word, means lawn, and it was adapted after into the English language after the Louisiana Purchase. This is 80 years before the Louisiana Purchase, so we're talking about a long time ago. And when he comes to this area, he describes these vast savannas, and he talks about the fact that bison ranged in droves across the savannas in the morning. And his Indian guides had to wait until the sultry times of day, the hot times of day, when those bison would go down into the stream bottoms where there were cane thickets, river cane, which is a native bamboo, and hunt them there. Because if you shot them up here in the uplands of South Carolina's Piedmont back then, there weren't trees to hide behind, and back then you're using a muzzleloader musket, right, to try and shoot a 1,000-pound animal or more. And it's likely not going to go down in one shot, so you better be able to run and hide. And they simply couldn't do that in the savannas that they roamed in during the daytime. So that tells you a lot about what the upstate's ecology was like back then. And then if you look at the distribution of what we call endemic species, those plants that are truly unique to the Piedmont, you don't find them in upland oak hickory forests. There's not a one of them. Where you find them are in places like Piedmont Prairie remnants, granite outcrops and glades, shallow soiled sites. You find them in open communities, and that's because the habitat that dominated for thousands of years was a habitat that was dominated by grazing and fire. And those two systems are essentially gone today from most of the Piedmont. So with all this alteration, you wonder, how much have we lost? Well, Piedmont Prairie is what we would probably call an extinct ecosystem today. The examples we have left are only those that have either been restored, or they're tiny little patches on really unique soil that is really difficult for trees to grow on. So we really don't have this ecosystem existing in the way that we're trying to have it exist here at the South Carolina Botanical Garden today. But the things that make their living in these early successional grassland habitats are dependent upon, whether it's Piedmont Prairie or a European analog that we've introduced onto the scene to graze cattle, they're dependent on these grasslands for survival. So things like the meadowlark, eastern meadowlark is found only in these early successional grassland communities, and their populations have declined over much of their range by more than 90%. The county I grew up in the mountains of North Carolina, it used to be the most common bird song in the spring, and today it's virtually gone, just because people's activities have changed and we don't graze cattle all the time. None of us have dairies up there anymore. And today trees tend to dominate the landscape. So these wildlife openings and these prairies and these grasslands and these expansive landscapes even that we need of grasses are incredibly important for so much of our wildlife. Not just meadowlarks, but our shorebirds. We now have 19 species of shorebirds visiting this area because they also really are grassland species. Many of our raptors, things like bobolinks and dick thistles, swallowtail fly or scissortail flycatchers, so many things that in this state today are only in just a place or two left. They need this habitat if they're going to have a future in South Carolina. And you know, the Native Americans were burning these sites, as Catesby described, in the spring. They were burning them to create the grass, and they weren't burning them to create bobolink habitat. You know, they were burning these grasslands to create grass, which create bison, and created elk, which created a better life for their family. So we have a long and we have a rich tapestry, a rich tradition of our own manipulation and use of the landscape that is translated over thousands of years into a dependence, really, on the hand of humans to ignite the torch that sets this system ablaze and really sets the stage for so much of what really builds our natural heritage here in South Carolina. And that goes way beyond the Piedmont. Longleaf pine ecosystems in the low country and the Midlands, and even the ridges up in the mountains, which would have had some savanna habitats on them too. So it's really a statewide phenomenon that depended on us.